In the southeast corner of Australia, there's a system of stone channels, dams, and traps built to farm fish, and it's older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, and older than almost every first civilization your school textbook ever taught you about. It wasn't built by a kingdom with a name we've heard of. It wasn't built by anyone who left behind writing. It was built by the Gunditjmara people of southwestern Victoria, and for a long time, almost nobody outside Australia had heard of it. Then archaeologists carbon dated the site, and the number that came back was so old, it forced historians to rewrite what they thought they knew about how early human societies actually worked. This is Budj Bim, and what's buried in this landscape doesn't just rewrite Australian history, it challenges an idea that's been baked into how we think about human civilization everywhere on Earth. Let's start with the basics, because even the basics here sound almost unbelievable. Budj Bim sits in a region of Victoria shaped by an ancient volcano, Budj Bim itself, whose eruption around 30,000 years ago sent lava flowing across the landscape and left behind a maze of volcanic rock, wetlands, and waterways. For most of human history, volcanic landscapes like this were seen as obstacles. The Gunditjmara people saw something else. They saw an opportunity. Using the natural volcanic rock scattered across the landscape, the Gunditjmara built an enormous, deliberately engineered system of channels, weirs, and dams designed specifically to manage the movement of water and, more importantly, to manage the movement of eels. Short-finned eels migrate through this wetland system every year, and the Gunditjmara didn't just wait around to catch them, they built infrastructure to trap them, funnel them, and hold them in place, essentially creating one of the world's oldest known aquaculture systems, a farmed food source engineered directly into the landscape. Here's where it gets strange. Archaeological and geological dating places the oldest parts of this system at approximately 6,600 years old. Some researchers argue certain elements may be even older, potentially stretching back much further, tied to volcanic activity in the region. To put that in perspective, 6,600 years ago is roughly 2,000 years before the first pyramids were built in Egypt, and well over 3,000 years before Stonehenge's first stones were raised in England. This wasn't a temporary fish trap thrown together for one good season. Evidence shows the system was maintained, modified, and expanded over literally thousands of years, by generation after generation, functioning continuously for a length of time that's almost impossible to compare to anything else on the planet, still in use in some form today. And this is the detail that really matters, because it directly contradicts something historians assumed for a very long time. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model of Aboriginal Australian society, pushed heavily by outside observers who never properly studied it, was that Aboriginal people were purely nomadic hunter-gatherers, moving constantly, with no permanent settlements, no large-scale engineering, and no food production systems resembling farming. Budj Bim doesn't just complicate that picture, it directly disproves it, because alongside the eel traps, archaeologists have found the stone foundations of permanent circular huts, not simple temporary shelters, but structures built to last, clustered in villages large enough to support a settled population living in one place for extended periods, sometimes potentially year-round. Some estimates suggest these settlements could have supported communities of several hundred people at a time, sustained specifically by the surplus food the aquaculture system provided. A stable, engineered food supply meant people didn't need to move constantly to survive. They could stay, they could build, they could pass down infrastructure to their children and their children's children for thousands of years. This is where the story reaches into something bigger than just one archaeological site in Victoria. Historians and anthropologists have long used a very specific checklist to define what counts as a complex society: permanent settlement, food surplus, engineered infrastructure, and long-term continuity. Budj Bim checks every one of those boxes, and it does so thousands of years earlier than many of the civilizations that get taught as the first examples of this kind of development. And yet, for most of modern history, Budj Bim wasn't mentioned in that conversation at all. It took until 2019 for UNESCO to formally recognize the Budj Bim cultural landscape as a World Heritage Site, and notably, it was the first site in Australia to be listed exclusively for its Aboriginal cultural value, rather than being included as a footnote alongside natural landscape features. So how exactly does the engineering work? Because this isn't just a few rocks stacked in a stream, it's a genuinely sophisticated system. The Gunditjmara constructed channels up to hundreds of meters long, cut and arranged through volcanic rock to redirect water from Lake Condah and the surrounding wetlands. Woven traps, made from local plant materials, were placed at key choke points to catch eels as they migrated. Stone walls acted as dams, allowing the water level to be controlled and adjusted seasonally, which meant the system could manage flooding during wet periods and maintain water flow during drier stretches, essentially giving the Gunditjmara control over an entire wetland ecosystem ecosystem's water levels for the specific purpose of maximizing their eel harvest year after year. And here's a detail that tends to surprise people even more. Evidence suggests the eels caught in this system weren't only used for immediate local consumption. There's archaeological and oral history evidence pointing toward eels being smoked and preserved for trade, potentially transported and exchanged with other Aboriginal groups across considerable distances. That means Budj Bim wasn't just a local food source. It may have functioned as an economic hub, producing a surplus valuable enough to trade, thousands of years before anything resembling a formal economy existed in most other parts of the world we typically study. Now here's where things get even more remarkable, because Budj Bim isn't an isolated one-off discovery. It's part of a much broader pattern that's only recently starting to get proper scientific attention. Across Australia, archaeologists and Aboriginal knowledge holders working together have identified other examples of large-scale Aboriginal engineering that don't fit the old, purely nomadic narrative at all. Stone fish traps exist at multiple sites across the continent, some potentially thousands of years old, engineered similarly to funnel and hold fish during tidal or seasonal changes. Some regions show evidence of controlled burning practices, commonly called fire stick farming, used deliberately over thousands of years to shape vegetation, encourage the growth of specific plants, and manage the landscape at a continental scale, essentially a form of large-scale environmental engineering conducted long before agriculture in the traditional sense existed elsewhere. This raises a genuinely uncomfortable question for how history has traditionally been taught. If permanent settlements, engineered infrastructure, food surplus, and long-distance trade were happening in Aboriginal Australia thousands of years before similar developments occurred in regions considered the cradle of civilization, why did it take until the 21st century for this to receive serious, widespread scientific and public recognition? Part of the answer is uncomfortable but straightforward. Much of early European colonial documentation in Australia either ignored, dismissed, or actively erased evidence of Aboriginal engineering and settlement, partly because acknowledging permanent Aboriginal land use directly complicated legal and political justifications used to claim the land as unoccupied. The technical legal term used at the time was terra nullius, meaning nobody's land, a doctrine that stood in Australian law for nearly 2 centuries before being formally overturned in a landmark 1992 court case. Sites like Budj Bim stood as physical evidence directly contradicting that legal fiction the entire time, hiding in plain sight in the landscape, largely unexamined by mainstream Western archaeology until relatively recently. And here's a detail that connects this story directly to the present day. The Gunditjmara people never lost their connection to Budj Bim, despite colonization, forced displacement, and generations of suppression of Aboriginal land rights across Australia. Oral traditions describing the construction and function of the aquaculture system survived and were passed down. When archaeologists began serious excavation work at Budj Bim, starting in the 1970s, much of what they uncovered didn't contradict Aboriginal oral history, it confirmed it, sometimes down to specific structural details Gunditjmara knowledge holders had described for generations before a single excavation trench was dug. That's genuinely rare in archaeology. Usually, oral tradition and physical excavation exist somewhat separately, cross-referenced cautiously. At Budj Bim, in many cases, Gunditjmara knowledge directly guided archaeologists to features they wouldn't have identified on their own, meaning the discovery of Budj Bim by Western science wasn't really a discovery at all. It was, more accurately, the first time mainstream archaeology finally caught up to knowledge the Gunditjmara people had maintained the entire time. There's also a broader mystery still being actively researched: exactly how far this system of engineered wetland management extended and how it connects to other lesser studied sites across the region. Some researchers believe evidence of similar aquaculture and settlement infrastructure may exist at other wetland sites across Victoria and beyond, potentially still undocumented, buried under centuries of vegetation growth, farmland development, or simply never properly surveyed with the same scientific attention Budj Bim eventually received. Every few years, new sections of channel or additional stone hut foundations are identified as survey technology improves, suggesting the full scale of this system, even after decades of research, still isn't completely mapped. So what does Budj Bim actually prove when you step back and look at the whole picture? It proves that a complex society, permanent settlements, engineered infrastructure, surplus food production, and long-distance trade existed in Australia at least 6,600 years ago, built and maintained continuously by the same cultural group for an almost incomprehensible length of time. It proves that the idea of Aboriginal Australia as purely nomadic and unchanging was never an accurate picture. It was, at best, an incomplete one, and at worst, a convenient historical narrative that served a specific colonial purpose. And it proves that some of the most significant archaeological discoveries left to be made aren't necessarily buried deep underground, waiting for the right excavation. Sometimes Sometimes they're sitting in plain view, in a landscape people have lived in and maintained the entire time, simply waiting for the rest of the world to finally start listening. And maybe that's the real story here, not just a really old fish trap, but a functioning piece of infrastructure built by hand from volcanic rock, engineered well enough to still show its purpose clearly today, maintained continuously by the same people for thousands of years longer than most civilizations we study have even existed, standing as quiet, physical proof that the true age and sophistication of human ingenuity in Australia was never actually a mystery. It was simply ignored for a very long time by people who never bothered to ask the people who built it.